here. But anyway, let me cordially welcome all of you in the first of a series of webinars on the future of the WTO, or the WTO of the future. At CUTS, we have been strong advocates of a freer, fairer, rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its center since its beginning. As some of you may recall, about around 2 years ago, we ran a campaign on what would happen to a world without the WTO. Where among those panelists here, several were also participating in that campaign. We consider the cost of doing global trade in the absence of the predictability and stability provided by the WTO. Needless to say, such costs would be enormous and would turn the clock back on globalization and trade-led economic development. 2 years later, in the run-up to the much-delayed WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, commentators were already writing obituaries lamenting the demise of the WTO and trade multilateralism. And the surprising part is that many of my educated friends who were not necessarily involved with trade and economics always thought that the WTO is dead. Anyway, it has been 5 years since the last ministerial, 7 years since an outcome, and almost a decade since a multilateral agreement had been concluded. There was widespread gloom and expectations of another stalemate at the WTO, which would have been the last straw for the organization. Yet, the WTO defied the odds and delivered at MC12. The WTO is very much alive and kicking. After intense negotiations and trade-offs, the members have finally been able to reach consensus on some issues, maybe partial consensus. There is a new midway agreement on fishery subsidies in place, outcomes related to a pandemic response package, waiver of TRIPS obligations for COVID-19 vaccines, etc. Food security and electronic commerce have breathed a new life into the institution. And I must thank all the ministers who were there, and particularly the WTO DG, Ngozi, for putting all her best into it and coming out with this kind of situation where we are not going to look back, but we're going to look ahead. Now, where do we go from here if you're going to look ahead? The institutional inertia has just been broken. Full restoration of the dispute settlement mechanism, moving forward on crucial agriculture trade topics, and consensus on what shape WTO reform should take remain challenging issues. Luckily, we are privileged to have a top-notch panel with us today to discuss these issues and the future of the WTO. Let me welcome and thank Pascal, Amita, Mark, Deborah, and Mia for taking out the time and joining us today. A special thanks to my dear friend Montek, all our dear friends who have kindly agreed to moderate today's session. I could think of nobody better to guide today's session than Montek, who has been a distinguished commentator on the global economy for decades. He's not a trade specialist like Ngozi, and therefore one can very well expect him to come out with some very fresh thinking on this. And all of us are too immersed in the incestuous world of trade policy. Thank you once again. That is one of the reasons why I requested Montek to moderate this so that he can bring in some fresh thinking into our discussions. Well, let me thank you all once again, particularly the distinguished audience that I can see who have joined us today, and I look forward to a productive discussion. May I now hand over to Montek for his opening remarks and request him to take forward today's session. Montek, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. As you said, I'm not a trade specialist, so I think we can skip opening remarks from me. I think we're all agreed that's a very important subject. We're also all agreed that what at one stage seemed to be a very broadly shared global consensus on how to proceed forward has frayed very considerably. And it hasn't frayed from the developing countryside. It has really frayed from the advanced countryside, in a way reacting to an unexpectedly strong emergence of China as a major trading partner, and perhaps not living up to what they expected China would do once she was admitted into the WTO. So I'm expecting to learn a lot. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a very great pleasure to invite our our first speaker, Pascal Lamy, who needs no introduction whatsoever, having served for a long time as DG WTO, before that as European Trade Commissioner. So he's, so to speak, seen it from both the individual negotiating side as well as someone presiding over the whole process. And for the last several years, he's been part of the Paris Peace Forum. He's the president of the Paris Peace Forum, which sort of uniquely brings together governments and civil society, non-government organizations. That is increasingly perceived to be the way to go if you want to make all these international governance related institutional developments have a kind of anchor in individual countries. So with those quite inadequate words, but since we have limited time, let me simply invite Pascal to make his remarks. Pascal, it's good to be sharing for a forum with you, even if it's only virtual. So please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Montek, and thanks to Pradeep for this invitation. Glad to be back with you, especially you, Montek. We haven't had an occasion to chat for some time, and you know I respect a lot your wisdom and experience. Right to the topic. Like all of us, I suspect, in this conversation today, I'm very happy with the results of this 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, which the result of which exceed expectations. So good that it happened, and I share what Pradeep said. Unlike some of us in this conversation, I must say I never thought that the WTO was on the brink of death. But that's a conversation we've had in the past. I think in reality, there is a sort of capacity in the system, even if WTO members do not agree on a lot of things, there is a sort of capacity of the system, not least because of its necessity for global market capitalism, whether we like it or not, this is the dominant system. But yet, let's recognize that there may be a new dynamic, there may be a new energy, probably due to the incredible dedication and engagement of his DG Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who, as everybody knows, is a good friend of mine. I think I can say openly that we've been friends for a very long time, and I think she did very well in knocking a few heads at the right moment, which is what the DG of WTO must take the risk to do if a few things happen. Now, if I'm right that there is some energy, it has to be put at the service of moving the WTO forward. The reality being that in many areas, this world has tremendously changed for the last decades, and that the WTO itself has not changed to the tune of the changes in the world. Two main directions in order to reform the WTO, to make it more fit for purpose in coping with today's and tomorrow's obstacle to trade, which are of a different nature than the ones that existed 20 or 30 years ago. First, the rule book. Second, the decision-making process in WTO. And these two things need to be considered both on their own value. One has to do with updating the rule book. Where are the areas where we need to renegotiate or adjust or invent new rules? It's the case, in my view, in the area of the leveling the playing field as far as international competition is concerned. We have a problem with subsidization, whether it's in agriculture, and that's a long-standing problem, or whether this is with industry. And this is a problem we've had as long as the Chinese system remains very much a state-controlled and state-subsidized system. So that's one. And there's an issue there, which is an old issue, but which needs to be relooked at, given the major importance of China in the world economy today. Then you have this nexus between trade and environment at a time where environmental priorities come to the front because of climate change, because of loss of biodiversity. We have to demonstrate that opening trade is conducive under proper conditions, including carbon pricing, to improving the state of the environment, which we know is in a dire situation, and the degradation which we are witnessing for the moment, both for climate and for biodiversity, need to be reversed, and there's a lot to be done. And third, I would put digitalization at the number 3 on this priority list for updating the rule book. We know we are already very much in a digital area, and rules of WTO were done at a time where digitalization was not what it was. How can we make sure that the global digital ecosystem remains as convergent as possible? And we know this is a big challenge, given different sensitivities for political reasons to data circulation, data storage, data protection. So this is a big one. And finally, and many of you have heard me saying this in recent years, I think the WTO is in need of reorganization of its own process. The way the organization works today is not conducive to quick, efficient results, even if member states have a sort of in a more agreeing mood. I think we need to rebalance the respective roles of members and of the Secretariat. The potential of the Secretariat to move WTO forward is underexploited. This mantra that WTO is only member-driven, in my view, needs to be reconsidered. We need, in my view, to give more influence, more responsibility to the Secretariat of the WTO in the way diagnosis is done, in the way options are explored, in the way compromises are proposed. I know that there is a reluctance among WTO members to recognize a bit of a higher degree of institutionalization of WTO. I used to say, when I was DG of WTO, and I remember this view, the WTO needs to move from what it is, which is an organization, to what it should be, which is an institution. And this, in my view, also entails a work on the way the decision systems is processed, by recognizing, and that's my final point, that at the end of the day, of course, it's for the members to decide. But the upstream process leading to a decision by the members can be simplified, hastened, and made more efficient. And I think we should use this new ambience in the WTO and among WTO members to go in this direction. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Pascal. I should check something with Pradeep. Pradeep, can you hear me?
Yes.
You know, the rules you had laid down was that each speaker will speak for 6 minutes and have a second go of 5 minutes. Now, Pascal being such an expert and an insider, I didn't have the heart to try and get him to stop at 6 minutes. I think that would have been unfair. Do you want me now to observe the 6 and then 5 rule for everybody else? Or shall we let each one of them speak and then give each one of them 2 minutes to come back after hearing everyone else?
I'll go along with your
I think that might be
suggestion.
actually a little more practical.
Right,
So
right.
if everybody agrees, that's what I'm going to do. I hope you can, yeah. The next speaker I'm going to call on is Amita Batra. So Amita, welcome to the show. I should add, by the way, that she just produced an outstanding book on trade policy for India in the 21st century, which I recommend you all to read. And Amita, you will get about 9 minutes. And please compress what you have to say in 9 minutes. And we'll give you 2 minutes at the end to come back based on what the others have said. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll make 3 points and this is basically to provide a context to what should be or how the WTO should be placed in the evolving context that we've seen as far as global trade is concerned. I think, as was mentioned by Pascal, that the global trade context has changed drastically in the last 2 decades. I want to highlight this point to say that we need the WTO to reform, but it needs to be a WTO of the future. Why I say that is, one, because I'll just take a longer term perspective of the last 2 decades to say, that as far as the WTO is concerned, it has had diminished effectiveness right through these 2 decades. Ever since it adopted the Doha Development Agenda, which was in the interest, which had an explicit specification of catering to the interest of developing countries, it has in fact not performed up to the mark. So the ineffectiveness as far as the WTO is concerned has been there throughout these 2 decades, very much evident. It's only towards the end of the last decade that we saw the final nail in the coffin. Of course, many of us were saying that we never considered WTO to be a dead organization, but it's also true that negotiations have slowed, many times suspended, and finally not happening at the end of the last decade. So as an organization, we have not seen it perform effectively in terms of the objective that it was set out to accomplish in these last 2 decades. That's one. 2, as a consequence of this, there have been alternative formulations that have evolved in the world. And these have been seen in terms of the stupendous increase that we've seen in the number of regional trading agreements across the world. The regional trading agreements, I think also I'll divide into 2 parts, First, in the first decade, as far as 2000s is concerned, carrying over from the 1990s, greater liberalization, first in tariffs, then as tariffs, the average MFN tariff across the world came down to below 5%. We've had these RTAs focusing on other aspects of liberalization in trade, which could be in terms of regulatory, which has been in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of investment liberalization, services, all of which to be able to facilitate that particular component of trade which was dominant, that is trade in intermediates or parts and components, basically the global value chain trade. So in the first decade, right up to, even probably up to the global financial crisis, we saw these RTAs to be moving in the direction of further liberalization of trade. After that, you see, in more recent times, what have we seen as far as the RTAs are concerned, acquiring a different character. Of course, not only in terms of enlargement as far as size is concerned, but also in terms of being cross-regional. We've seen mega regional trade agreements evolve, which have included large number of countries across regions. So it's no more RTAs, but FTAs, PTAs, mega regionals in nature. What we see today as a consequence of the 2 crises in the last couple of years, you see the pandemic as well as the Ukraine crisis, more so the Ukraine crisis, is the evolution further of these RTAs. As I see them today, you see, we are looking at a possibility of greater fragmentation of trade blocs across the world. Probably the appearance or the possibility of a large number of fragmented trade blocs, which would be dominated by power relations and geostrategic objectives rather than by efficiency or trade expansion. What we've seen in the last couple of years, or more recently, as far as nearshoring of value chains is concerned, which leads trade to a large extent, and which leads the global value chains, that is going to get converted in terms of nearshoring to friendly nations. We're going to be looking at regional trading agreements that are going to be alliances between regional economies, but regional friendly economies. The agenda has become more in terms of creating resilient supply chains in terms of safe and secure supply chains. So you're looking for alliance partners, even in trade, which are going to be your friendly alliances or which are going to be your friendly allies. The prospects, therefore, are of RTAs developing probably more liberal within, more open within, but probably also closed to the other trade blocs, you see. We may see many of these, we may see just 2 of these being dominated by or being led by 2 dominant trade economies of the world. Simultaneously, what we are also looking at is economies that are not members of these RTAs, are not members of these mega regionals, to get into localization, increase protectionism, localization of building complete supply chains on their own, close to the outside world, increasing protectionist policies that they are adopting to be able to build these supply chains within their own country, finding basically domestic suppliers of inputs for almost all products that they're trying to produce. This is a combination of a protectionist tendency that evolved not necessarily only in the pandemic, aggravated, of course, during the pandemic and after. Even in the Ukraine crisis, the many export restrictions that we've seen. But even in 2018-19, if we look at the global alert trade data, you see the database that we have on protectionist measures, what we see is in 2018-19, the number of protectionist measures to be much higher in over a decade, the highest as far as 2018-19 is concerned. So it's a trend that was already building in the last decade. We saw a very high level of protectionist measures in 2018-19. Of course, much of it being a consequence of the bilateral policies that were adopted by the United States as far as tariff increases are concerned against the Chinese economy and Chinese imports. But even otherwise, pandemic and then post-pandemic, we have seen a greater number of import restrictions, export restrictions being adopted by countries. One, as a consequence of building resilient supply chains, safe and secure on your own, either be a part of an RTA, which is going to be among friendly allies, or do it on your own by substituting from within. All these trends, you see, that build up to tell us, you see, that as far as the global trade context is concerned, that has changed very, very significantly. The RTAs, as they did build up, you see, in terms of mega regionals, had provisions which were largely WTO plus. That is, the WTO of the times was not capable of dealing with those provisions or providing for the kind of trade investment services nexus that was required by the evolution of trade contours at that point of time. So what we are looking at now, you see, is an altered global context, an altered global trade context in terms of simultaneous moves as far as regional trading arrangements are concerned, as well as in terms of increased tendency to be more and more protectionist. What do we want now? We do want a WTO. We do want reforms as far as the WTO is concerned, because ultimately it's only going to be a multilateral system that can provide the right kind of transparency and the norms and rules to be able to make trade fair, especially when you have this kind of a context that has evolved globally. So as far as the preeminent priorities of the new kind of WTO that we want to see, one is in terms of building, I think a rethink as far as decision-making process in the WTO is concerned. Do we still continue with consensus, increasingly diverse interests as far as members, large number of members, the 164 member economies of the WTO, very diverse interests? Can we continue with consensus? Consensus, personally, I believe the first best option, but can we possibly do it in the given context? The option that has been adopted in the last few years in terms of plurilateral initiatives, is that the right way to go forward? Open-ended plurilaterals, I think, need to be discussed very, very significantly and in a very detailed manner for us to be adopting those as the mode of going forward. Personally, I feel plurilaterals may not be able to represent the interests of all until and unless we are able to define who becomes or what is the kind of membership, what is the norm for membership, or what is the norm, defining norm as far as plurilaterals are concerned. Plus, I think digital trade, as has been mentioned already, some of the WTO plus provisions that have already been included in the RTAs will need to be dealt with by the WTO of the future, including, of course, the big the big element as far as state-owned enterprises and subsidies are concerned. I think these should be the priorities for the WTO of the future. Thank you. I'll stop it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Amita. That's a pretty comprehensive review, and you kept within the time limit, for which thank you very much. And now I'm going to ask our next speaker, and that's Mark Linscott, who's the non-resident senior fellow at the South Asia Center in the Atlantic Council and a former assistant USTR. So Mark, can we have your views? And again, 9 minutes.
Sure, thanks, Montek, and I certainly will stay within that time limit. It's early here in Washington. I think I've been successful in corralling my cats so that they won't be an unwelcome interruption this morning. I want to note that at the start that it's a real pleasure to be here. I've known Pradeep for quite a long time. I always appreciate the perspectives from cuts, always a breath of fresh air on trade, and particularly the WTO in terms of its expertise. I'd like to start off with just a little bit of bad news, and this is really stating the obvious, and that's that the WTO has lost a lot of its relevance over many years now, and frankly, I think it's unlikely to regain the central role that it had in global trade, certainly in the days of the GATT and in the early days of the WTO. My personal experience, and this is going back to the late 80s, I grew up in trade in very much an increasingly MFN world, a most favored nation world in which at least GATT contracting parties, for the most part, exclusively treated each other on a non-discriminatory basis. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992, it appeared that MFN, housed in the GATT, and then at that point the WTO was becoming universal. It was a real end of history moment, as described by Francis Fukuyama. However, there were always exceptions in the system, and one of the most significant exceptions, perhaps the most significant exception, being for FTAs, RTAs, as Amita just highlighted. And more, this exception has swallowed the rule in terms of the multilateral trading system. Now we find ourselves in a much more preferential global trade world. The WTO has not actively negotiated tariffs multilaterally since at least 2012 and has no real prospect in the near future. So FTAs have proliferated and it's provided for preferential treatment. Now, the good news is that the WTO is slowly learning to do incremental results. It's been a long, ugly process, but the MC12 results are more evidence of this. Just reviewing the results, the fish subsidies agreement was very significant. It was a long time in coming, more than 20 years of negotiation. It includes important prohibitions on harmful subsidies, IUU fishing, overfished stocks. Importantly, it did not include a transition of 25 years, which had been on the table. It's a partial result. It's creative in terms of providing a four-year sunset clause, which should provide impetus to go much further. The TRIPS waiver agreement, I don't think it's really satisfied anyone. Certainly the NGOs aren't satisfied. Those stakeholders who are concerned about the impacts on innovation feel that it won't make a difference in terms of COVID, and essentially is a broadside attack on innovation and an undercutting of an important agreement, the TRIPS agreement. There were significant statements on export restrictions in the context of food security, COVID measures. Frankly, they're not game changers. There could have been much more done on COVID with respect to export restrictions, better market access, better regulatory alignment. Finally, definitely a positive outcome in extension of the e-commerce moratorium. That was very welcome and was hanging in the balance right up until the end. Unfortunately, no results on ag reform. And there was no expectation of concrete new commitments, but there was not even a roadmap going forward, certainly in areas like market access, domestic support. There was some hostage shaking in terms of public stockholding. We all know that NAMA, non-ag market access, industrial tariffs, that's been dead for years. And that's another reason that FTAs have continued to proliferate. WTO is not able to negotiate on tariffs any longer. There's been really good work on plurilaterals, on the joint statement initiatives. However, this ministerial conference was not a moment to deliver any of those results. Just a couple of words in terms of the major players, and I'll start with the United States. It certainly is better now than it was during the Trump administration. That said, I think that the Biden administration is not hugely focused on the WTO. I think that the Biden administration could step up a bit more. It's certainly compared to the Obama administration, what happened in Bali and Nairobi during the Obama administration. The appellate body is still broken. There's been a potential for U.S. departure from the plurilateral government procurement agreement. There are new proposals on Buy America. And frankly, there's a lack of a balanced trade policy. I was the assistant USTR for environment for a long time. I really care about these issues, but a preoccupation with labor and environment, trade liberalization essentially gets no attention. China is supportive of multilateral, but mainly in talk, not so much in action, and its non-market behavior continues to be the greatest challenge to the WTO going forward. India, under the Modi administration, it claims it's reform-oriented on global trade, but continues to hunker down in nationalistic and protectionist policies, first with Make in India, now with Atmanirbhar Bharat. It is making very important moves to negotiate FTAs, but I think it's seriously stuck in decades-old policies on the WTO, and frankly, more interested in pitting developed countries against developing countries, and ensuring that the WTO does as little as possible to intrude on policy space than having a vision for the future. Finally, the EU, and it's ironic for me to say this, at least for myself. I think the EU is probably the most committed and focused of the big players, but it has its own policy legacies, for example, on fisheries, and it's much more focused on FTAs. The bottom line is that if the WTO is to have a serious future, all the major players need to do more and just demonstrate commitment to change and relevance. And there are some overlying this, there are clouds on the horizon. The Trump administration took steps, I think very harmful unilateral steps, and sidelined the WTO with respect to invoking national security, which is highly questionable, in imposing tariffs under Section 232, in engaging in a tariff war with China. The EU is experimenting prospectively with a CBAM, with a carbon border adjustment measure, and understandably so, but that is going to create new tensions. China's doubling down on its favoritism for SOEs and non-market behavior. Just to conclude, I've always been hopeful about the multilateral trading system in WTO. I spent most of my career in it. But one modestly successful ministerial conference does not promise success in the future and does not reverse the trend line. So there's much work to be done going forward.
Thank you very much, Mark, for those very wide-ranging, and you raised practically all the really interesting sources of controversy kind of questions that should hopefully carry this debate into more interesting areas as we move ahead. And let me now call on Deborah Elms. She's the founder and executive director of Asian Trade Center. Deborah, nine minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is a bit of a challenge for me, this particular event, I have to say, because it illustrates a point that I was making in this piece that I put out today about the glass being not half full or half empty, but barely full of liquid, barely with liquid in it at all. And the challenge to me is that we had a ministerial that ended and most people paid zero attention, and not just mainstream media or regular media outlets, but also business associations that you would have thought or might have imagined would be keenly following the details. Very little attention was paid, but in the trade community, everyone is, enthusiastically celebrating the outcomes of MC12. And so for me, that's a bit of a split screen, right? So on one hand, we have the average individuals who haven't got a clue what is happening and aren't interested and can't be persuaded to be interested, no matter what you say or do. And the small trade community declares that this is some sort of, major triumph and the institution is rising from the ashes and all things are going to be well going forward. I think that is a challenge. I mean, it's been a challenge to talk about the WTO for a long time. I mean, I have staff members who weren't born the last time the WTO actually did something really powerful and compelling that would make them pay attention. That's always a challenge, to get people who don't have the memory of what that looked like to be interested in where we're at today. And I was part of the RTPC, the regional training course, this week, actually, to talk about agricultural trade as the Asia regional component of this training course. And what I found, again, so striking about that experience was the participants on the line from Asian economies were all asking questions, and there isn't a lot of an answer in this particular area. We were talking about agricultural trade, but there wasn't a lot of answer for them because most of the discussion was about rules that were last created, again, before some of them literally were even born, and certainly, at their early years. I mean, they have no recollection of what happened or why, and they cannot understand, and I think this is fair to them, they cannot understand why what seems to be the most urgent and burning issues of the day can't get discussed. Like, what is the problem? Why can't we address this? Why haven't we addressed that? Why can't we bring this to the table? And so I think it's not that this is insurmountable, and I'm hopeful that a small victory does build some momentum, but I mean, I'm old enough to remember that we've been here before. And I just think it's a challenge. And the members, we can have a discussion about member base. We can have a discussion about how we reform the institution, all of which I think is very smart and very sensible. But when I look at the WTO, there's a big part of me that's increasingly saying, you get the institution that you want. And I think, in fact, the members are not that keen on having this institution. And that leads us, every time we have an MC, to come right up to the cliff, to hover on the edge, to come off with some kind of modest victory and declare success and momentum for the future. But at the end of the day, the members are not really rolling up their sleeves and engaging in this. And it's particularly striking, and I know it's been mentioned before, but I'll just highlight it again. It's particularly striking, the disconnect between what is happening in Geneva in the WTO space and what is happening, especially here in Asia, where we have the same governments enthusiastically working on economic integration with one another, liberalizing tariffs, opening up services markets, discussing new ways to do investment, lots and lots and lots of work on digital trade in all kinds of new and innovative ways, discussions beginning about how would we think about the trade implications of climate, what does that mean for us, how do we make more resilient supply chains? I mean, there's a whole lot of sort of new, interesting, cutting edge kinds of things that are happening in the region that is not reflected in Geneva. And the big challenge, of course, is why isn't it and how do we get it there, especially because many of those cutting edge issues cannot and will not be solved in a bilateral regional space. We're not going to deal with the climate crisis in a regional way. We can't deal with subsidies really in a regional way. You can't deal with some of these digital concerns in a regional way. And so how do we move governments that are enthusiastic about integration still to be much more integration focused in Geneva and try to move this sort of creaking institution forward in a way that makes sense? And obviously there's a lot of discussions about ways to reform the institution or the organization in Geneva, should be welcomed. But I think we have a bit more of a fundamental grassroots problem, which is we have to create an environment in which it's not just trade nerds that are interested in the WTO, but the larger community, including crucially businesses and consumers who ultimately benefit from whether this institution works or not, to have a stake in it, to see it as part of something that matters to them, matters to their lives. And that is a transition that I think is actually challenging to do. And it probably requires more effort from the trade side to be thinking more creatively about how do we engage, not just with each other, where everybody is, happily discussing trade jargon at an unbelievably dense level, but how do you explain it to your friends and family who are going to somehow then be interested in whether or not this organization succeeds or fails? So lots of challenges. We've had lots of challenges. I'm hopeful because I do see integration happening in Asia, and I think, well, if it can happen here, then it can surely happen in a larger setting. But I can't see modest success at the WTO in this last ministerial as necessarily paving the way for a rebound of the global trading system. So how we get there is, again, a subject, I guess, for wise heads, and hopefully some of these institutional reform discussions, some of them discussions about members, about what they can do to support the system will pay off. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Deborah. That very nicely brings out all the tensions. I particularly liked the perception that, it's only the trade nerds that are interested in what's happening in WTO. But the larger community, whether politicians or businesses, don't really seem to be interested at all. And that is the single biggest warning signal about the future of an institution. So thank you. And now the last speaker for this round is Mikic. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes, you are. Thank you so much. I face also additional challenge as Deborah started to, her remarks. Speaking last is always a challenge because, there are pros and cons of that. In this case, with these expert guru speakers speaking ahead of me, maybe the best option for me would be to say that, I agree with everything that they have said, and then yield my time to the participants to probably, put in more points. But I think Pradeep wouldn't have been happy with me if I chose that option. So I have to struggle with the disadvantages of speaking last and try to bring in maybe some additional points, which is really challenging, as I said, after those four spoke. Now, I think Pradeep set the tone quite nicely by mentioning that he did organize some time ago, and I think some of us were part of that, a conversation on what the world would look like without the WTO. And he referred to, everyone agreeing that that would be really bringing to the world and prosperity, etc., a huge costs. And I just, just a regular folks will always refer to someone who died as not really, understanding how much they will miss them until they were gone. And I think the same reference can be used for the global trade system, that we really do not appreciate we don't really appreciate the value of having a global or multilateral trading system until we do realize its possible demise. And then sometimes we manage to sort of make sufficient moves to prevent that demise, and that happened several times since the establishment of the WTO. And as some of you were saying, it also happened last week in the MC12, where a sufficient sort of energy was found to deliver a Geneva package that some called unprecedented. Some would say, well, we are not really seeing what is in there for us. But the question is really, and I was just talking to Annabelle last night and to some other people, and so there are many people who are quick in dismissing success of the WTO, not only in MC12, but previously since its establishment. And I would want to ask, what is the benchmark that we use when we evaluate the success of WTO as an organization, or in terms of protecting what it inherited from the GATT, which is a continuous sort of efforts to keep cooperation and integration of the markets going, with throwing to it additional challenges. We have to understand that GATT was dealing with, reducing high tariffs. Everyone was interested in that. And then we were adding a little bit of NTBs. There was some dispute, but there was nothing so much and challenging and pitching the countries or the members against each other as we have thrown into WTO. And so I really, I would want to ask, what is the benchmark for the assessment? If we use RTAs that we are seeing forming around the globe as the benchmark, and we see them liberalizing and putting in new rules and moving ahead with very innovative, creative ideas of integration, then we have to realize that they do that within the context of chosen partners to do it with. So this is not forced marriage. This is where you fall in love with someone and you want to go along with them. And so you agree on the path, right? And so this brings me back to what Pascal was saying. How do we actually treat the decision making as a starting point in what we do in WTO, which is labeled as consensus, and then which forces all 164 plus 20 in the waiting to somehow come to the single common agreement on the things that are actually rightfully cannot be seen in full agreement, because they have different developmental implications and different value for all of those members. So I think it is very necessary to start the modernization of the system or the organization, if you wish, by modernizing the decision making. That is the first and foremost. And then after that, we can actually turn to what else we want to do. And I think the reason why we have successful, in relative terms, joint initiatives currently being negotiated is exactly that it allows members this breakage of the consensus as it is imposed on them into mimicking the way of operation that they have in the formal RTAs. And so they can then move along. So the question is then, why do they even try to to do it through GIs in the context under the umbrella of the WTO, when they can easily do it, as someone was saying, outside the whole system, and face less trouble and do it much quicker and not being questioned or blocked all the way. I think that because the members still understand, and that goes to the points that all of you were, all the speakers were putting in, that they still value the spirit and the rationale of having multilateral system. So we have to have like common rules that will align with the common purpose, but we have to allow the multiple movable sort of ways of moving forward this increasingly complex set of rules, because we now are dealing with digital. When GATT was established, we were still, I think we still use telex machine as an operation, right? I certainly know that when I was doing my dissertation, I was doing it on the electrical typewriter, and so when you transfer the environment of that formed the rules that we had in the establishment to today's presence, of course, that we don't have relevance. Right. And the first thing that when Deborah was saying that ordinary people don't really know about WTO, don't pay attention, don't care, because even though the things were going wrong, the rules were there. And if we are to follow what we have discovered through the pandemic, even though some countries tried to move completely unilaterally and disregard the rules, etc., we did have some sort of a gravity towards the common rules and disciplines in the GATT. And we did go through the crisis, perhaps not with a total disaster. So people really didn't notice, that was the element that was helpful in getting the medicine, getting the vaccine, and getting these other goods to them, even with the disruption, even with bottlenecks, etc. And I notice my time is starting to disappear away from me. Just 2 words. Montek, because Pradeep asked me to specifically mention 2 areas in which WTO sort of disappointed perhaps last week, and this is that it didn't really emphasize the work that did go into the creation of work program for micro and small and medium-sized enterprises and women and trade. And so this, of course, for the groups interested in those in that work, and I think this is 51% at least of world population in the context of women, but all of us should be interested in that, and all of us should be interested in business and promoting small business through trade. We definitely should have done better in that, and I'm not going to go into the reasons why we chose to sort of quote unquote sacrifice those 2 areas in the context of not putting up the prepared statements and declarations to be adopted. We can comment on that perhaps later. But how to go away, how to learn from that and perhaps move ahead, I think, again, back to what was Pascal was saying, we need to actually understand the decision-making process, not only whether it is Geneva, capitals, and we can discuss the effect of that, but also who is making. And we have been hiding behind this is a members institutions or not, etc., for a very long period of time. We need to actually allow those that have the keen and ground interest in these areas, like business, to contribute to the decision making in the process. WTO doesn't have Business Advisory Council. It has started now to establish a certain way through which it consults with through the research contributions on women and trade issues. But we need to actually ask whether we can modernize the rules by asking those that have to implement and depend on those rules in their everyday livelihood to contribute to the creation to those rules. So let me stop there because you were very kind with allowing me a little bit longer than I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, let me thank all participants for more or less sticking within the rather tight time limit. And we move to the second stage, where each of you will get 2 minutes to sort of, if you like, clarify something in the light of what others have said. And that would take about 10 or 11 minutes, which would mean we would have 20 minutes left, assuming that 4:30 is a hard stop. I don't know, Pradeep, whether it is a hard stop. If so, then we'll leave things open for a while for questions. And thereafter, I'm being asked to make some concluding remarks. I guess that's like getting the most ignorant person in the panel to sort of pronounce finally on what he's learned. So there may be some interest in that. So with those words, Pascal, please come on stage and take your 2 or 2.5 minutes.
Thanks, Montek. 2 main points after having carefully heard my co-panelists. The first one is, guys, let's refrain from hyperbole. No, the WTO was not on the verge of death. No, this MC12 is not a triumph. Both of these proclamations are, in my view, excessive. The WTO is not as efficient as it should be, but let's look at the results. After all, trade is more open today than it was yesterday, and it was more open yesterday than the day before yesterday. And the global trading system has survived the 2008 crisis, the COVID crisis, where trade overall worked much better than we could have accepted under the dramatic impact of such shocks. And if one wants to be convinced that the WTO is still a relatively important organization, for sure, it works better than the UN Security Council. So this is something which we need to have in mind. Second point, which is where I think I'm worried about the future of open trade. I'm not worried about the future of open trade because of the Mark Twain's demise of the news of its coffin being there. No, I'm worried about the future of open trade because I think we are moving to a new category of obstacle to trade, which do not have to do with protecting producers from foreign competition, like traditional tariffs, subsidies, quantitative restriction, blah, blah, blah. We are moving a world where obstacle to trade will stem from discrepancies in the ways governments protect their population from risks. Safety, security, environment. This is the area where, in my view, there is the biggest risk of fragmentation. And the problem we have there is that this is extremely complex. Standards of precaution on pesticide residues or on the safety of bumpers are incredibly complex questions. This is, in my view, where there is a risk of fragmentation for the future. And this is also an area where the traditional notion of special and differential treatment does not work anymore. Protectionism can be with viable geometry. You can put a tariff high tariff on roses from Israel, a bit less from Colombia, and 0 from Rwanda. If it's about pesticide residues, Israel, Colombia, and Rwanda are on the same category. So the future of obstacle to trade is, in my view, in this area. This is where we have to focus our minds. This is where we have to be inventive. And this is where we have to invent something around WTO, which doesn't deal with tariffs or with subsidies or with quantitative restrictions, but with standards of precaution. And whether or not this will converge is, in my view, the big thing in the future. And the digital world is precisely a good example of where precaution is exercised in different ways, in different places, hence obstacle to trade. That stem not so much from the measure, but from the discrepancy among the measures. I think this is something which organizations like CATS, countries like India, should matter a lot for the future. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to ask Amita, Pradeep, let me suggest that if you're going to get responses from your audience, maybe you'll put in place a system where they can ask questions and you can have some mechanism of selecting those questions so that you select the questions and pose them to whichever panelist the question is addressed to. And that way we'll have a more organized subsequent session. So if that's okay with you.
That's okay. If I can make the announcement to the audience, they could use the chat box to put in their questions, which will help us, as Montek pointed out, to be able to respond to the maximum number possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Amita, let me request you to have your second bite at the cherry.
Thank you. Not very different from what I said earlier. I think what's important is to realize, take into account the realities of the world today, the way trade has moved in the last 2 decades. I mean, we can debate on whether WTO has been successful, to what extent, whether or not it's carried forward, what it was, in terms of inheritance from the GATT, etc., performed better or not, But I think what's important here is whether or not the context of today, whether or not the institution as it stands today can perform to be able to successfully deal with the challenges that the global context places for it. The MC12, yes, has given us some, some achievements. We can say that, these are limited, these are partial, but these have not even come close to dealing with the challenges that are in front of us, or that the kind of rules, the manner in which trade, in terms of both volume, value, rules, norms, has changed in these last 2 decades. The manner in which RTAs have taken forward trade today, trade rules. I mean, we may talk about, as Deborah said, we can't deal with issues of environment and climate change within regions. We have to have multilateral forums for that. But it's a fact that we do have RTAs evolving their own rules even in these spheres. We can't deny that bit, So until and unless we have an institution that is ready to face the realities of the world, that things have changed, the context has changed, and it needs to deal with the newer context, rather than only talk about achievements of legacy issues that come down to it, or that have been with it for 2 decades, and that which it has not been able to resolve. I think there is a difference here. We need to deal with both at the same time to be able to now have an institution that can serve the purpose for all. Because I don't think the RTAs, no matter how far they advance in terms of rules, norms, as far as the changed context is concerned, can serve everybody. They cannot serve the least developed economies. So in terms of what the WTO was set up, as Mia said, what is the benchmark? The benchmark is for what it was set up: freer, fairer trade for all. So fairer trade can be ensured only if we have norms and transparency ensured by monitoring coming from the WTO, not from the RTAs. Certainly not the manner in which RTAs are evolving today and are likely to evolve in the background, given the background of the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis. I think that's something that we need to grapple with as people who are interested in trade in the institution, and in making trade work towards development. I think that's the point that I'd like to end with. And before I give over, I think just a thank you to Mr. Ahluwalia for the appreciation for my book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Actually, those who are readers in India should read Amita's article in the Business Standard, which gives you a quickie look at the big messages of her book. I've no doubt she's also doing tweeting and other sorts of social media coverage, which gives you the message in even briefer form. But thank you, Amita. Next speaker is Mark Linscott. Mark, will you come back in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Montek. I'd like to just say a few more things about this this relationship between multilateral and FTAs and regional. And it's clear that the trends have been unrelenting towards more FTAs. Ever since Jagdish Bhagwati warned against the the consequences of a spaghetti bowl of FTAs. There is tension there. So many governments and trade ministries within governments increasingly have focused their resources, their time on negotiating FTAs and less so on WTO. I was the assistant USTR for WTO and multilateral for a number of years, yet I was constantly frustrated with my negotiators being pulled into FTAs because they were functional people, whether it was standards, TBT or SPS, or they were doing FTAs. They weren't helping me on WTO. So there was that that tension. But the genie's out of the bottle. We have these new circumstances, and the multilateral has to deal with it. And I think it will. I mean, as Pascal has noted, this isn't a moment for hyperbole. It's that the WTO is not going away. In fact, all of these agreements depend on the WTO. They are built on the WTO. They often reaffirm obligations in the WTO. And that's critical. I think at this point in time, it's important for the multilateral to be able to borrow from what's going on in FTAs. FTAs can be laboratories for doing work that needs to be done, whether it's on the regulatory side, whether it's on the environment side, and even climate. There's been work in those areas, and the moment is coming, I think, for the WTO to take. It's given over many years. Now it needs to take in terms of benefiting from those experiences, taking up some of those issues, negotiating its own rules, perhaps doing so on a plurilateral basis if there's not multilateral consensus to move forward in certain directions. But I can imagine a thriving environment of multilateral and regional, and they don't have to be pitted against each other going forward.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mark. Deborah?
I think, though, that the poaching of resources, if you have two individuals or one individual who can do two jobs, the poaching of individuals on the trade agreement, free trade agreement side is going to continue until and unless we could do two things. One is, of course, we can show that the WTO is delivering real results to especially domestic constituents, stakeholders in the domestic space, but also into the sort of broader space. And I think we really need to figure out some way, and this is where the challenge is, of course, how do you get people interested in the WTO? I mean, I always say the WTO is the foundation and the FTA is the house on top. And you can't have a beautiful house and a remodeled kitchen and a gorgeous bathroom if the foundation is not solid. So you have to have that foundation. Otherwise, there's no point in picking out, new fixtures for your bathroom. The problem is that most people don't care what their foundation looks like. They're not interested in that. The much more sexy and exciting part is, whether or not you're going to have blue cabinets or white cabinets. So I think that we have to figure out some way to make sure that it is clear, crucially to me, to political leaders in each key market, that that foundation matters to them, that it still matters to them, and that if it goes away for whatever reason or becomes even more dysfunctional, that we all have a problem, because I think that's for me a real challenge, is getting people to understand the importance of that WTO before you have completely demolished the foundation. And so how do we, as a group of people who are interested in trade, keep making that argument, I think is more important than ever. And it goes into a sort of broader argument, which is a real challenge these days, on why trade, forget the WTO, just trade matters to anybody. And I think that is increasingly challenging as well, to explain to people who are convinced that doing everything in your neighborhood 20 miles from you is the only way to get a range of desirable outcomes with no consequences to cost, complexity, lack of choice, et cetera. So I think we have to do a better job of explaining why the WTO matters, but even more urgent, why trade matters and why it matters to all of us in all of these markets. Otherwise, we can never get the momentum you need to rebuild or patch up that foundation before it is a real problem for whatever it is you've built on top of it.
Thank you. Thanks, Deborah. Mia, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. I have to agree with what was said, but let me just drop in a small caveat there. It used to be really true that FTAs were based on, the WTO, and many of the provisions were referring to the WTO agreements, particularly as SPS, DBT, dispute settlement, etc. I don't think that the more complex, deep agreements of today actually do that. They go and create their own sort of space in which they try to regulate, and that's why they are WTO plus. Of course, they have the genesis of what is WTO, but they go much deeper, and so sometimes they are not recognized as being, as Deborah was saying, they don't publicize that for different reasons, and they don't realize that actually without those foundations they wouldn't actually perform that well. But just another question also to ask, in a context of what we are expecting of the WTO. Is the WTO actually panacea? Is it the solution? Is it the single solution to all these challenges that we were mentioning prior? Climate change, inclusivity, going the wrong way, so inequalities increasing, conflicts in the world, inflation, etc. I don't think that we can really burden WTO to be the sole sort of solver of these issues, and that's why I think the way how WTO has progressed last year was very positive, in a sense of collaborating with the institutions that take lead in those particular areas of challenges like climate change, the development and financing for development, the monetary and the financial issues, labor standard issues, etc. And I think this is the way forward to really enrich the possibility of both trade policy contributing its own, what it can contribute in its own right, but we can't expect the trade policy without the corollary policies and the support will actually deliver everything that we are challenged with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Pradeep, we have just about 15 minutes left, and so maybe 7 or 8 minutes for questions to be answered by the panelists. Maybe you can choose 7 questions, and they should indicate to whom they're addressed.
Yeah. Can I ask a question to all of them? Montek?
Well, that'll take up 6 minutes or so, but that's fine.
No, in the context of the discussion that we've had so far, we agree that the WTO was conceptualized to provide a level playing field and to provide handicaps where countries were not competent to deal with that. And then we had, of course, this issue about agriculture subsidies in the West, which has always been a bone of contention. And one of the things the Chinese say, they don't talk about our industrial subsidies. when you can't address the agricultural subsidies in the West, and therefore, there's nothing wrong that we are doing. Having said that, what we do realize is that the agricultural subsidies, including the agreement on textiles and clothing at a point of time until it was alive, was a kind of enforceable special and differential treatment in favor of the rich countries. So there was these kind of anomalies which existed, and one of the reasons which Amita pointed out was the issue about the Doha development agenda. Some questions still remain in the minds of a large number of countries, and therefore they're not sure. But how does it all? The question that the panel I'd be happy to hear is, how do we deal with it in terms of what should be a WTO of the future? How can it deal with many of these issues? What kind of issues? It can say, fine, let's drop these issues. And Mark, you remind me of Jagdish Bhagwati's very famous quote that don't contaminate the agenda with non-trade issues, for example. And so, these are various issues which we'll have to think about in order to think about a WTO of the future. I'd like to hear from
maybe Pradeep, let's get a few of the audience questions, and if there's time, the panelists can think. Your question is something that I wanted to respond to also. Right. So we can give the panelists half a minute if they want to add to what I say.
Can we ask Hamid? Hamid, would you like to raise a question? Hamid, are you there?
Hamid, you're on mute.
Yeah. I can hear you.
Excellent. Yeah. Now, the discussion is wonderful. I congratulate everyone, and people who know me would understand why the title of this event is so close to my heart. But the point I'm raising now is with respect to what Pascal said, and I think he made a very, very pertinent point about the new reality of obstacles to trade today, which is regulatory diversity. And regulatory diversity is a huge issue that will continue to face the WTO until the WTO reforms its way of operating. Now, one of the obstacles that were mentioned, I think, by more than one participant is the consensus rule. What would you suggest? Because from my point of view, I don't think the problem is with the consensus rule per se, as much as it is about the abuse of the consensus rule in terms of imposing it where it is not legally required. It's like the launch of JSIs. There is nothing in the rules that says that there is a legal requirement to have an agreement by the 164. How do you have the right kind of conversations that would lead members to clarify existing rules on things like how do we apply consensus? So that I think is an important question to deal with the rest. But let me stop here for the lack of time. Thank you.
Pascal, do you want to respond very specifically on the question of how do you deal with the consensus problem?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, first, there's no other possible rule for the moment than the consensus. And the reason for that is that there is no alternative. A majority system where 3 small countries would have a higher voice than either US or China or EU is just pie in the sky. So we will have to remain with consensus, but I totally agree with what Hamid said, while noting that consensus is not unanimity. And there is a difference between consensus and unanimity. Unanimity is a situation where you don't have to explain why you object. Consensus is a situation where those who oppose the consensus have to explain why they oppose the consensus, and that makes a difference. Now, this being said, we have to relook at the WTO statutes and Hamid is right. Some decisions that are traditionally deemed to be taken by consensus, which are in reality process decisions, should not be taken by consensus. I've been holding the view, although I never really went public on this, not to be unnice to my successor, that, for instance, the US veto on the nomination of appellate body members was an excessive application of consensus. Nominating an appellate body member and producing properly with a due process a new appellate body with new members is not something that should be done by consensus, for instance. So totally agree that we should separate issues that are for consensus and issues that are not for consensus. And this would go some way in improving the way the WTO works. On the rest, I agree with Hamid, who, by the way, agreed with me, which may be one of the reasons I agree with Hamid, that the WTO of the future is one where regulatory discrepancies, regulatory diversities will be somehow leveled, and this necessitates a huge transformation of the relationship between WTO and standard-setting organizations in the international system. Trade negotiators will not negotiate on pesticide residues or on the size of bumpers. So this is a big issue in terms of organization for the future. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Pradeep, you have to now pronounce. I mean,
Montek,
either I
Mark
say
has
my
raised his
bit.
hand. Montek,
Yep.
Mark has raised his hand.
Oh, okay. Mark, go right ahead.
Sure. I'll try to just take 30 seconds. And first of all, I totally agree with Pascal Lamy, and even on that appellate body issue, even though my former organization is the one that that vetoed the appointment of appellate members. But and it's great to see Hamid. You know, I think the real I agree. You know, there's no alternative to consensus in terms of new rules, and I think the real test to come is plurilaterals, JSIs that are about rules. You know, it was easy with the ITA and with financial services and basic telecom to, you know, get a consensus for getting something for free if you were not part of that agreement. With rules, it's going to be different. You know, with e-commerce, if a group of countries have put together an agreement, a plurilateral on digitalization, and they put it before the membership, you know, how does consensus work in that situation? And so I think that's a test to come, and we'll see how it unfolds. So, you know, I just highlight that for the future.
Thank you, Mark. Pradeep, if you want me to make any comments, then I think we should choke off any further questions. Okay. I'm quite happy not to make comments if you think the questions.
Your comments are most desirable.
We need Montek's wisdom.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about you're going to get my ignorance. Well, look, first, I want to congratulate Pradeep for actually organizing this session. I think others have said the same thing. We do need groups like CUTS and others to bring the trade issue up to the forefront and have a sensible discussion and a rethink on many of these things. So congratulations, Pradeep. Now, you know, having listened to this discussion, I had the following reactions. Number one, I mean, everybody seems to agree that we can be happy at the outcome of MC12, but it's a very minimal type of happiness. I mean, all it means is that no one actually wants to abolish WTO, but no one expects it at the moment to be able to have a real guiding role on the future development of trade. Now, that's a problem if you think trade is important. I'm not saying how I'm going to solve it, but I think we should recognize it. And we should certainly not think that the outstanding success of MC12 has somehow finessed this problem. It hasn't. All that is done is the organization will continue and the salaries that are being paid by WTO will continue, but it doesn't prove at all that you're going to get forward movement in trade policy or even a building of consensus. My first point. Second, and this has been made by Pascal and others, there's no question that the changing world calls for very different things to encourage deeper global integration. I mean, historically, trade negotiations were about lowering tariffs. Over time, since the whole idea of fair trade went beyond tariffs, I mean, Pascal emphasizes security, safety of consumers. You can talk about other things, labor standards, which people people care about objectively, but also which affect competitiveness. Because if you're running the kind of political system that doesn't allow trade unions, then you can argue that you're in effect subsidizing industry by holding wages down below what they would be in a situation where trade unions were allowed to operate. So I think these issues cannot be ignored once trade becomes as important as it has become. So it was bound to happen that the issue would come up. And I mean, many aspects have been mentioned: IP, environment, climate change, and all of that. You know, one interesting thing here I want to comment on is that developing countries have generally not been sympathetic to thinking about the broadening of the agenda. I feel that one of the reasons for that is that we have got quite sort of hitched or hooked onto the notion that the world wanted to have a development route. Now, actually, I buy the notion that the development round concept was invented by the US in 2001 because that was the time just after the Twin Towers attack. And you wanted to get a sense that the world is coming together, and the easiest way of getting a lot of developing countries to support was to say the Doha Development Agenda. But the truth of the matter is that raised far too many issues that nobody was actually willing to address in substance. And developing countries, on the other hand, thinking that agriculture was finally going to be addressed and it would be a development round, kept judging the outcome in terms of what they thought was relevant for development. So it's a classic case of over-pitching expectations and locking people up into very, very negative positions. Now, you know, the issue of if you're going to have trade, people are going to be concerned that trade must be fair. It's very difficult to imagine otherwise, especially because we know that trade isn't just a win-win for everybody. It is something that improves GDP in most cases. Jagdish Bhagwati, of course, pointed out that in certain restricted cases where your export prices might be affected, even GDP may not be maximized. But whatever it is, it does have a distributional impact. And I think that this was ignored largely amongst Western countries. I mean, the problem that trade was creating negative impacts on distribution was evident even in Vancouver. I mean, the unhappiness about the, if you like, the labor interests was evident well before the financial crisis, but somehow it was kind of ignored. And I think that this issue of fairness extends now to things like the concern about SOEs being a form, state-owned enterprises in China being a form of disguised subsidy. And, you know, sometimes it leads to pretty extreme views, like the United States, quite independent of China, in their discussions with Mexico, sort of wanted to insist that for the trade in automotives across the border, the wages paid in Mexico should be at some reasonable level. Now, you know, that is more or less like, you could argue, is denying the Mexicans the benefit of having a lot of cheap labor. But still, the US took that view. So, I mean, that issue of what is fair can become complex. Added to that issue of just economic fairness, we now have the concept of a geopolitical fracture. That's an independent development. One can imagine that it wasn't there, but it is there and is being worsened by Russia, Ukraine. And that has led to a non-economic concern, which is friend shoring. And you can translate that into economics by simply saying security. And it certainly makes sense to say that, look, you can't just rely on economic considerations. It can't be all based on just in time. You have to take into account just in case. So you want to diversify. But friend shoring is not about diversifying. It's diversifying towards friends. So that is a new dimension that has come in to become the basis of expansion of trade. And I mean, they got completely new developments like the growth of digital trade, which quite frankly, very few of us have actually thought about. And it's a very interesting, UNCTAD, for example, has produced some piece which says that imposing digital taxes would be very good for developing countries. But a European institute has pointed out that it's a very flawed study. And if you take into account general equilibrium effects, it would be very damaging for developing countries. Now, quite honestly, these things are not being adequately discussed. I'm now referring, I don't know about the rest of the world, I'm now referring to India. They're not being adequately discussed. And they're not being adequately discussed because somehow it is assumed that trade negotiation is just to be left to negotiators who will get the best deal they can. And in our context, there is a historical tendency that everything that is trying to extract more freedom from us is somehow this horrible phrase, limiting our policy space. Now, you know, any international agreement hopefully limits everybody's policy space. The only reason you limit your policy space is that the limits that the other fellows expect are supposed to give you some benefits. But this is not discussed at all. I mean, I feel that Pradeep and Amita and others have a big job ahead, sensitizing Indian discussants in this area. So now, having said that, what do we do? I mean, I don't have an answer, but I think I would only say that I conclude by saying that countries should face up to the change situation in a much more extended internal debate where these things are frankly raised, pros and cons put out, and our negotiators should be made to recognize that countries yet have to take a balanced view of their national interest. Pulling out the file on the basis of which we negotiated 5 years ago is irrelevant. And quite frankly, unless that is put on the agenda loud and clear, all you will get is a repetition of the arguments that we have traditionally made. And certainly, I think in the Indian case, that would not be a good thing. Second issue, which I think Pascal mentioned, which I think deserves that we should think about, that should the Secretariat have more of a role? Now, this is actually very connected with the deep suspicion amongst many developing countries that if you let the Secretariat have a big role, then the Secretariat will actually only push for the interests of developed countries, and the developing countries will get short shrift. And to my mind, more transparent systems of discussion, bringing in better expertise, we can make sure that whatever the Secretariat does, its recommendations are made sufficiently transparent so that it can't simply be acting as a spokesperson of the developed countries. Third point, the consensus rule. Quite honestly, I'm not knowledgeable on this, but it seems to me we should just abandon it. I mean, going to a qualified majority makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've got 160 plus countries over there. And the idea that every one of them, many of them are minute. So I don't see anything wrong with the situation where you can change the rules, providing countries accounting for whatever it is, 85% or even 90% of world trade are willing to change the rules. I think we should seriously think about this because, you know, the only circumstances, I mean, the only things that work are things like the Bretton Woods institutions where the boards vote, but they vote on a weighted basis. So the fact of the matter is a handful of countries which carry enough of a majority can actually give a clear direction. The way consensus is interpreted in many contexts amounts to saying every country must have a veto. Now, to my mind, that's a recipe for non-progress. So I think we need to think seriously about that. I take some heart in the fact that there is some suggestion that maybe the dispute resolution mechanism may get a fresh lease of life. I mean, it's not assured, but the wording of the ministerial suggests that something will happen. And that's an area where if there are differences of view, I think developing countries should be willing to negotiate to come somewhere in between. Finally, my very last point, because I think I'm now overstretching my own time. You know, I don't think all this can be done by trade ministers. I mean, the fact of the matter is finance ministers were unable to make a sensible response to the 2008 crisis provoked by the collapse in Northern America, in the North Atlantic on the banking side. You had to bring in, the G20 had to be reconvened at the summit level because it was felt that finance ministers by themselves would not be able to do it. I really think that on trade, if we start a process of thinking, we need to take this matter up both in the G7, which is sort of representing the advanced Western countries, and in the G20. If we get a moderate agreement in these two fora, then quite frankly, there is hope for what the WTO could do in future. So that's my last word. Pradeep, you've disappeared from my screen, so I don't know whether the transmission is also.
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm
Anyway,
here.
thank you for giving me the extra time. Thank you.
Montek, thanks a lot for an excellent comment at the end of the thing. And these are things I can see are the ingredients of your future blog in the Mint. That will help us to take forward these issues with the Government of India particularly. Now, before I end, there was a question from Victor Prado, another experienced trade negotiator. As the largest question, may I request if, Victor Prado, Victor, if you can just raise the question and we can leave the answers to be answered through a mail.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on this excellent panel. This is one of the best I've seen, and I would suggest that if I were to give a suggestion to any of the WTO members, I would tell them to task this panel that you put together today to do WTO reform. It would be absolutely perfect, I'm sure. But what I wanted to say is that the language on reform is less than impressive in MC12. Really not great. And I would ask, if you were to start reform, there are issues like consensus rules, there's issues like MFN treatment or not in the JSIs. There's, of course, dispute settlement. If this panel were to start reform, where would you start? And do you think it's reasonable and rational to start reform? What are your prospects now? Thank you very much, Pradeep, and congratulations.
Victor, before you go, if you can put these questions in a mail, and I'll put it through this group, because we are already, I think Pascal has to leave, and so have others to leave for other meetings.
All right.
But I wanted you to raise a question, but I knew it's going to be another wise question.
Thank you very much, Pradeep.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for this excellent thing. And we are holding a second panel on the 14th of July with another set of wise people who have contributed to trade in the past and would be able to take it forward. So it's not going to be, as I said in my opening remarks, this is the first of this, and so therefore we're happy with what has been discussed so far, and we can get back to certain very basics or specificities in order to say how we can take forward the agenda. Words which I picked up from Hamid, in fact, the WTO of the future. And therefore, Hamid was very happy to have been invited to speak. Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Montek. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Pradeep.
Take
Bye.
care.
Mark,
Thank you.
have a good day.
Everybody.
Have breakfast on my name.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Mark was there since 5:30 a.m. Washington.
That's tasking.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.